Well, I can say it's probably been the most intense part of my working life. Just the need for adaptability and speed and flexibility. And I'd also say thank goodness for China, because the relatively quick recovery of China and the fact we've got good strong trades into China has really buttressed and held up the total economic recovery in New Zealand. But for us, in the first part of the period, sort of starting in February, it was like a plunge down to the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It was air freight, and it was business continuity, and it was cash flow. So we put a huge amount of resources into those topics early on. I think we underwrote 357 different air flights, and 500 different business continuity clinics for exporting customers. And then as the pandemic unfolded, companies needed to go digital and really grow out the e-commerce channels. And so digital clinics, so we've run about 400 digital clinics, going out to lots of exporting customers, helping them get onto the big platforms, JD.com, Tmall, and how do they build up their capability and their execution competence in getting onto those e-commerce platforms. That's been a big acceleration of a megatrend actually, and that's taken up a lot of our activity. Yeah, just the overall strategy is that the government invested $216 million over 4 years into a trade recovery strategy. That's a joint activity between us and MFAT, in fact all across NZ Inc. And as part of that, we increased the number of companies that we could support. And of course, part of those companies were companies that were going into China as well. And then in market, employing a lot more people in market, because we being a lot more boots on the ground for companies all over the world, and so employing more people, and they're doing a greater range of activity for customers than they would normally do, as we become the eyes and the ears and the boots on the ground for companies and markets. So just gearing up both more customers and more support for each customer.
At the very beginning of the lockdown in China, right the way through to the present day, we've been heavily engaged in trying to keep New Zealand's brand alive in the hearts and minds of consumers, and of course our trade channels in China. The brand work has really been driven by bespoke content and live streaming events specifically oriented towards Chinese consumers and our trade partners. We've also been undertaking digital destination training for travel agents in China. We've trained many thousands of Chinese travel agents whilst they've not been able to travel. So the efforts of Tourism New Zealand have really continued at a pace, obviously through much different platforms. Effectively everything now is delivered online and digitally, which is the way the Chinese consumer wants to receive that information. And of course the trade as well are finding those channels incredibly effective. Well, it's a really interesting question, because the preference amongst Chinese consumers, this is the proportion of Chinese consumers who find New Zealand appealing and place us as the first or second preferred destination to go to, show us that we're maintaining high degrees of preference. In fact, preference for New Zealand has stayed high throughout the whole COVID period. What we're also seeing at the same time is a decline in appeal. And appeal is sort of the broader population who would find New Zealand desirable or appealing to visit. And that's fallen from the mid-80s down to the mid-60s over that period of time. And that drop in appeal has actually largely been driven by geopolitical circumstance rather than necessarily from a destination perspective. So they've got a real balance of challenges going on there amongst consumers. In terms of the broader mindset of the consumer population in China, things like the great New Zealand halo effect around how we have responded to COVID-19 hasn't actually landed in China the way that it has in many of our Western markets, because as far as our Chinese consumers are telling us that they think China actually did the best job in the world at managing the crisis, and they see themselves as the safest place on earth as opposed to somewhere like New Zealand. So that's a real obvious thing that we've observed in the Chinese consumer versus other markets.